Let me give you a poem by Emily Dickinson, Because I Could Not Stop for Death. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun, or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown, my tippet only tulle. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. As we begin this poem, we're confronted by Dickinson's creation of an ironic tone. Death, that most serious of topics, is handled in a casual, almost offhanded way. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. Several different figures of speech work to create this tone. Most obviously, death is personified, and that in itself is not unique. We all have mental images of a personified death, often the Grim Reaper, a dark figure in a hood carrying a farm implement used for cutting down grain. But here in this poem, death is no Grim Reaper. He's a gentleman caller. He's someone who's picking you up for a coffee date. In fact, he's referred to as doing his work in a kindly way, an adverb, kindly, that implies that one does something pleasantly and in an accommodating manner, just as we might say a friend kindly loaned me a tool or kindly offered me a ride to church. But the idea that death kindly stops for us creates irony because, well, for most of us, death is not really something we consider kindly, and we'd just as soon death didn't give us a ride. The irony grows more intense in the next two lines through the juxtaposition of two things of dramatically different scale and kind, and which have very different associations for us. The first, the carriage held but just ourselves, is again a very simple fact, a casual statement. Who was in the carriage, somebody might say, and we'd say, oh, just us two. But the two are accompanied, we learn, by a third rider, immortality. And the concept of immortality is a difficult, lofty, and even frightening abstraction. So the juxtaposition of the everyday, just us two, and immortality is intentionally unsettling. It's quite a leap, an ironic leap. As we try to wrangle the effect of these lines and corral the figurative back into something more akin to reality as we know it, a key word is the simple verb stop, which takes on two slightly different meanings in the two usages. In the first line, it means to pause in order to take time to do something, rather like I stopped watching the video to make popcorn. But in the second line, we learn that death has stopped for the speaker. That is, death has stopped to pick her up, as we might say, the church bus stopped for me. And because the one driving the bus is death, we have to ask the question, what does it mean for death to stop for us? And we're pretty sure we know the deadly answer. So in summary, this first stanza tells us that the speaker has in fact died, and that she's now on her way toward her final destination, sitting alongside her friend death, and that greatest of all mysteries, immortality. I've taken a good bit of our time with just the first stanza because it creates for us the poem's central irony and foreshadows the theme of the poem. The following four stanzas, then, develop the tone and the details of the narrative more fully. In the second stanza, the speaker is responding to Death as one would a friend. And in fact, Death is such a civil, well-intentioned friend that she's not shocked that he's dropped by. She just stops what she's doing when he calls. In the third stanza, we look at the landscape passing by and we see that it suggests a whole lifetime. Childhood through children playing, growth and maturity through the gazing grain, and the end of things, the setting sun. In the fourth stanza, which modifies the setting sun, we get the sense of being left behind by all light and warmth, and even by time, since the sun passed us, leaving us in the dark. The speaker is now outside the normal progression of life, and we realize further that she, though not exactly afraid, is not really prepared for what's to come. If you look up Gossamer and Tippett and Toll in your dictionary, you'll see what I mean. And also why, when reading a poem, the first order of business is always to look up the words you don't know. In the next stanza, we find ourselves at a house, but it becomes only too clear that the house here is a metaphor for grave. The house is a mound, a swelling of the ground, and it's below the earth. The roof is just barely visible, and the cornice, which would typically be just below the ceiling, is underground. With the final stanza, the poem takes a turn, a change in direction. Based on the textual evidence, that is, all that's happened in the first 5 stanzas, we see that they've occurred in the course of one day, from daytime until just after sunset. But now the point of view leaps ahead by centuries, despite the fact that the time feels shorter than the fateful day when death stopped for the speaker, and she surmised, that is, she deduced or guessed, just where death was taking her. And our understanding or perception of time comes into question too. Is this what's meant by eternity? Is this place from where she's talking to us now what is meant by immortality? Dickinson wrote this poem nearly 2 centuries ago, yet it remains one of the most widely read poems in the English language. What makes the poem one in a million? Most obviously, maybe it's the importance of the theme. For as long as we've been humans, we've faced death with wonder, sometimes dreadful wonder, sometimes the wonder of anticipation, and sometimes just wondering. We all want an answer to the death question, and no answer has been 100% satisfying, even for people of faith. I believe, for example, that Jesus rose from the dead and opened the possibility of eternal life for everyone. But does that make me sure of what death or eternity will be like? Hardly. On the contrary, I suspect the person of faith may wonder about the nature of life after death more than anybody, and not always with pleasure. But why, of the thousands of poems written about death, why is this poem so widely read? It has an artistic excellence, of course. Well, we've touched upon some aspects of that here, but it would take a longer video than you'd watch to review all the things this poem does right. So for now, I'll just return to where I began, with the poem's ironic tone. There's no despair in this poem, nothing like the despair we feel in contemplating the loss of a loved one or our own death. But neither is there the kind of satisfying triumph we may feel from a faith perspective. Dickinson handles death in a curious way, with a curiosity that offers no final answer. And to some degree, I suspect, most of us are somewhere on the continuum of curiosity when it comes to death. So, a poem that engages us and upsets our typical expectations, forces us to think in new ways about a question we all ask, but which none of us ever quite answers. If anything, maybe the poem simply affirms that an engaged, contemplative curiosity may be, in fact, a pretty good response. And shared curiosity is itself a kind of affirmation.